Somewhere in Europe, a man wore the plague doctor's mask for the very last time. He treated one final patient, walked home, and never knew he had just become the last plague doctor in history. We don't know his name, we don't know the city, we don't even know the year for certain. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why that's true and why it might be one of the strangest gaps in all of medical history. You already know the image, even if you don't know the story behind it. A long black robe, glass eyes, empty and unblinking, a curved leather beak stuffed with herbs jutting out like the face of some impossible bird, moving through empty streets while people behind closed shutters listened for footsteps and prayed they wouldn't stop outside their door. Here's the strange part. Almost everything you think you know about this figure is wrong. That mask didn't exist during the Black Death, not in 1348, when plague first tore through Europe and killed perhaps a third of the continent. The costume you're picturing wouldn't be invented for another 270 years. It belongs to a different century, a different plague, a different kind of doctor entirely, which means the beak and the black robe weren't there at the beginning of this story. They arrived closer to the end of it. In that ending, one man wore it for the final time. This is the true story of how that mask was born, why it disappeared, and why the man who wore it last remains completely unknown. To find the last plague doctor, we first have to understand why there were plague doctors at all. Go back before the mask, before the beak, to a world that didn't have the one thing modern medicine takes for granted, an explanation. There was no germ theory. No one had ever seen a bacterium. There were no antibiotics, nothing that could touch the bacterium now known as Yersinia pestis once it entered the bloodstream. So when plague arrived, medieval Europeans reached for the only frameworks they had. Some blamed sin, believing the disease was a punishment sent from above. Others blamed the air itself, a theory called miasma, the idea that disease traveled on foul-smelling vapors rising from rot, from swamps, from the unburied dead piling up faster than anyone could manage. It was wrong, but it planted an idea that would eventually matter, that something in the environment carried sickness, and that environment could be managed, cleaned, and controlled. Into this fog of guesswork stepped the plague doctor. And here's the part history rarely talks about. Many of them weren't the elite, experienced physicians you'd expect. When plague hit a city, established doctors, the ones with reputations, wealth, and options, often fled, sometimes within days of the first reported death. Cities were left desperate for anyone willing to stay behind. Some towns hired doctors who were young, unproven, or simply the only ones left standing when the dust settled. In the archives of the Italian city of Orvieto, contracts survive hiring physicians specifically because the previous ones had died or disappeared, sometimes at rates of pay far higher than what a doctor could normally expect, simply because no one else would take the risk. In Venice, of 18 doctors recorded in the city in 1348, most had died or vanished within the year, leaving only one behind to care for an entire city. Pope Clement VI, based in Avignon, reportedly had to hire extra physicians just to keep pace with the sheer number of sick arriving at his doorstep. These were not superheroes. They were ordinary men, sometimes desperate, sometimes broke, sometimes simply out of better options, walking toward the one thing everyone else was running from. Every one of them was, in theory, a candidate to someday be the last. But none of this answers our original question yet. We're still almost 300 years away from the mask itself because the black robe and the beak you're picturing didn't belong to these men at all. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Fast forward past the Black Death, past the waves of plague that kept returning to Europe every generation or so, like a debt that never got fully paid, and we land in Paris in the year 1619. A physician named Charles Delorme, who would go on to serve 3 French kings across a career spanning decades, designed something new. A head-to-toe protective garment built specifically for treating the infected without becoming infected himself. A long coat of waxed leather or goat hide reaching from neck to ankle. Gloves, boots, a wide-brimmed hat marking him as a doctor, a kind of professional uniform recognizable from a distance, and the mask, a leather hood with glass lenses over the eyes, and that now iconic beak, roughly half a foot long, packed with dried flowers, mint, camphor, myrrh, or a vinegar-soaked sponge. Delorme believed the beak filtered the bad air of miasma before it ever reached the lungs. He was wrong about why it worked, But here's the twist buried inside the invention. He was accidentally right that it worked at all. The plague was actually carried by fleas riding on rats, and in some outbreaks, spread directly through the air between infected lungs. The waxed leather robe wasn't stopping miasma, it was stopping fleas from reaching skin. The gloves prevented direct contact with infected blood and fluid. The wooden cane, used to lift bed sheets and examine patients without touching them, kept the doctor a few extra feet away from a coughing, dying stranger. Purely by accident, one of history's most superstition-driven inventions became one of the earliest forms of what we would now call personal protective equipment, centuries before anyone understood the science behind why it actually helped. This detail becomes important later. The costume spread steadily through the 1600s. By the 1630s, it had reached as far as the Netherlands, and by a catastrophic outbreak in 1656 that killed roughly 145,000 people in Rome and 300,000 in Naples, doctors in Italy were contractually required to wear it as a condition of their employment. A famous engraving from that year, known as Dr. Schnabel, German for Dr. Beak, cemented the image into European memory for good. But here's a twist worth sitting with. The costume was probably never as widespread as pop culture suggests. Historians have only ever found two physical plague masks surviving from the entire period, and both come from Germany. Meanwhile, Italian theater, especially a masked character in Commedia dell'arte, known simply as the Plague Doctor, did far more to spread the image of the beaked figure than the real, physical presence of doctors wearing it in the streets. The legend grew larger than the practice ever actually was. Movies and Halloween costumes eventually made the mask timeless, but the real history behind it is messier, rarer, and far more human than the icon it became. So picture the real job, stripped of the theater. A plague doctor's day in a city under siege by disease might involve going house to house, sometimes hired directly by a town council under a signed contract specifying pay, housing, and length of service. He would examine the sick, lance the swollen, blackened lymph nodes called buboes when that was believed to help, record who had died, and report back to civic authorities who used those records to track how the outbreak was spreading through the population. In some cities, he would recommend which houses needed to be sealed off entirely, quarantined, sometimes with healthy family members locked inside alongside the dying, with no say in the matter. There was no cure to offer. What he brought instead was structure in the middle of chaos, a record of the dead, a professional presence, sometimes false comfort, sometimes real courage. Streets emptied, markets closed, church bells, once a sound of daily rhythm, became something people dreaded, tolling for funerals that piled up faster than they could be properly mourned. Doors were marked. Families barricaded themselves inside, watching through cracks in shutters as a figure in leather and glass moved from house to house, an outline against the empty street that meant one thing to everyone who saw it. Death had come to the neighborhood, and it wasn't finished yet. The plague doctor was, in this sense, not just a medical figure. He was a walking announcement. His presence on a street was itself a kind of grim news bulletin, visible from 100 yards away, and he did all of it knowing that his own life was part of the wager. Historical plague contracts sometimes included isolation clauses. The doctor himself, after visiting the sick, would be expected to quarantine, cut off from his own family, alone with everything he had just witnessed. Every single one of these doctors, in every outbreak, in every city across the continent, was one step closer to being the last, and still none of them knew it. So who was the final man to wear the mask? To answer that, we need to understand how the plague itself finally began to fade from Europe altogether. For nearly 400 years, plague kept returning to the continent in waves, arriving, devastating a region, retreating, and returning again a generation later. Then, slowly and unevenly, without one dramatic turning point, it began to recede for good. Historians don't agree on a single clean reason why. It was several forces, tangled together across more than a century. Sanitation improved gradually across cities, particularly in waste removal and the materials used in construction, which historians believe made urban environments somewhat less hospitable to rats. Quarantine enforcement, once loosely applied and easily bypassed by anyone with money or influence, became far stricter and more centralized, especially at ports, which were the entry point for almost every major outbreak. Urban rat populations may have shifted over time as well, with some historians pointing to ecological changes among rodent species as a contributing factor, though this remains genuinely debated among researchers to this day. Public health administration itself was maturing. Cities began establishing dedicated health boards, standardized reporting, and coordinated regional responses, instead of ad hoc, panicked reactions decided city by city with no communication between them. It's worth pausing on that uncertainty because it's part of the honest story. There is no textbook consensus, no single scientific breakthrough that ended plague in Western Europe. It wasn't a cure. It was a slow accumulation of smaller changes in cities, in policy, in awareness, each one closing a door the disease had once walked through freely, which means the plague doctor's profession wasn't retired by a triumphant discovery. It was slowly, quietly starved of the outbreaks that had once made it necessary in the first place. But here's the part that makes this story genuinely strange. Even now, historians cannot name a final plague doctor, not one name everyone agrees on, not a date, not a ceremony. And once you understand how the job actually worked, that absence starts to make sense. Plague doctors weren't part of one continent-wide institution with a central registry keeping track of who came and went. They were hired locally, city by city, outbreak by outbreak, under individual contracts negotiated with individual town councils, often for a single specific epidemic and nothing more. When an outbreak ended, many of those doctors simply went back to ordinary medical practice, treating the same kinds of patients they had before the crisis began. There was no retirement announcement, no final roll call. Municipal records from that era are incomplete, scattered across different archives in different countries, many lost to fire, war, flood, or simple neglect over the following centuries. Somewhere, in some city, a physician put on that leather coat and beaked mask for the final time in European history, and neither he nor anyone standing on that street had any reason to know it. To him, it was probably just another difficult day at a job he was likely relieved to be finished with. This is the emotional core of the whole story. History doesn't always end with a ceremony. Sometimes an era just quietly stops, and nobody thinks to mark the date because nobody realizes there won't be another one. If we can't name the last plague doctor, we can at least stand at the edge of the last great outbreak that would have needed one. Marseille, France, 1720. A merchant ship called the Grand Saint-Antoine arrived from the eastern Mediterranean carrying silk, cotton, and other valuable cargo, and unknowingly the plague as well. Quarantine protocols existed at the port, but commercial pressure won out over caution. Powerful merchants, eager to get their goods to a lucrative trade fair, pushed to have the ship's cargo unloaded early before quarantine had run its full course. Within weeks, the disease was moving through the city's poorer districts, then spreading outward. Over the next 2 years, plague killed roughly 50,000 people in Marseille alone, close to half the city's population at the time, and another 50,000 across the surrounding region of Provence. Bodies piled in the streets faster than they could be buried. A local official named Nicolas Rose organized crews of volunteers and prisoners to clear the dead from the worst-hit neighborhoods, work so dangerous that only a handful of the 150 men who took part survived. A physician named Jean-Baptiste Bertrand caught the plague himself while treating patients and survived, though his own wife and children did not. His written account of the outbreak remains one of the most detailed first-hand medical records of any plague epidemic in history, describing symptoms, treatments, and the sheer scale of loss in unflinching detail. Historians now regard Marseille as the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in Western Europe. After 1722, stricter quarantine enforcement, especially at ports across the continent, combined with the slower structural changes already underway for decades, meant that plague on that scale simply never returned to the region again. By then, medicine itself was beginning to look different. Hospitals were becoming more organized institutions, run less on superstition and more on observation and record-keeping. The beaked mask, the waxed coat, the wooden cane, the entire visual language of the plague doctor was approaching the end of its usefulness, not because anyone declared it obsolete, but because the disease it was built to face was fading from Western Europe for good. The era wasn't over yet, but it was closing, and inside that closing, The moment we started this video with actually happened. In one forgotten city, on a day nobody thought to record, a man put on that costume for the last time. He walked to one final house, examined one final patient, wrote perhaps one final report for a council that would soon stop needing him at all. Then he walked home. He didn't know he was the last. There was no sense of finality in his footsteps. No one lined the street to mark the occasion. He probably just wanted to eat and rest and forget the smell of vinegar and camphor for one night, the same way he had after every difficult day before it. We don't know his name. We may never know it. In an archive that burned or crumbled or was simply never kept in the first place, his story ended the way most stories actually end, not with a headline, with an ordinary evening that nobody realized would never repeat. History doesn't always end with a ceremony. Sometimes an entire era disappears on an ordinary day that no one realizes is the last. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more true stories history almost forgot.